Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a seriously fascinating contradiction. For decades, the standard story we've all been sold about Silicon Valley is this idea of a totally weightless economy. A frictionless, perfectly meritocratic machine that just spins pure intellectual abstraction into planetary wealth. We love to celebrate that pristine garage startup myth and the seamless, almost invisible magic of software. But that narrative, it's basically selective memory. It deliberately glosses over a really profound, very heavy, and often completely irreversible physical reality. So today, we are going to audit what we're calling the hidden ledger of the Silicon frontier.
Okay, let's dive right into this. On one side of the ledger, we've got the myth. This is that familiar story of frictionless, weightless innovation, where brilliant code just sort of magically floats up into the cloud with zero real-world consequences. But then, on the flip side, we have the reality. And the reality is that innovation on the peninsula has literally never been a cost-free process. It is this highly demanding metabolic reaction that requires an immense amount of physical, natural, and social inputs. The actual toll it takes to run and sustain this hyper-innovation machine is honestly staggering, and it's about time we actually look at the receipts.
Now, you're probably super familiar with that famous mandate from venture capitalist Mark Andreessen: software is eating the world. It's the core philosophy that drove all that high-speed blitz scaling we saw pioneered by firms like Y Combinator. But here's the thing our source material points out. When the software industry eats the world, it leaves behind a very real, incredibly heavy trail of crumbs. It essentially leaves behind a massive ledger of debt, and we are now seeing that debt surface in huge ways across our physical and social environments. So let's walk through exactly how this has reshaped the Bay Area. We're going to look at four main areas today. Number 1, the spatial crisis. Number 2, the environmental scars. Number 3, the always-on culture. And finally, number 4, infrastructural strain. Starting right off with our very first ledger entry, Section 1, the spatial crisis, looking at housing as an innovation tax. The mechanics of this so-called tax are absolutely fascinating. See, the most immediate and frankly violent cost of this hyper-innovation has been the systematic displacement of the region's human infrastructure. Think about it. By taking the absolute highest paid, most elite cognitive talent in the world and concentrating them all onto this one tiny geographically constrained peninsula, well, the industry inevitably sparked a massive spatial crisis. It started back in the 1970s as the Area 27 and South Bay engineering clusters began forming. Then, over the decades, as software and VC money pumped literal trillions of dollars of liquidity into the local economy, that insatiable demand slammed right into stagnant 1950s-era municipal zoning laws. The inevitable result? A massive tech gentry wealth premium. Property values just completely decoupled from local wage growth, which effectively priced out the essential workers, and created what's basically a polarized feudalism. And that brings us to what the source material powerfully dubs the commuter attrition engine, the displacement of the service and care workforce. We're talking the bus drivers, the teachers, the janitors. It isn't just some unfortunate accidental side effect. It is a structural byproduct of this specific cluster model. Because there is basically zero affordable high-density housing in the core, essential workers get pushed way out to the distant suburban periphery. And what does that mean in reality? It means grueling 2-hour daily commutes. It means deeply fractured familial stability. It means massively increased carbon emissions and severely degraded psychological health for the people actually keeping the region running. Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. Section 2, the environmental scars, moving from gold to silicon. So the history of Northern California's innovation is definitely not this clean, post-industrial story we like to imagine. When you pull back and really look at the deep history here, you see a long-term continuous cycle of profound ecological degradation. Take the 1850s, for example. Hydraulic gold mining permanently scarred the local topography. They used these massive water cannons that literally blasted entire mountainsides apart, which silted the San Francisco Bay with heavy metals that are still sitting right there in the sediment today. Then, jump forward to the 1960s. The microchip manufacturing boom arrives, promising this bright, clean future. But instead, it introduced vast quantities of toxic solvents, corrosive acids, and volatile fluorocarbons into the ecosystem. Which leads us directly to today. Did you know the region currently holds the highest density of federal Superfund toxic waste sites in the entire United States? Honestly, the irony is just stunning. Huge companies like Fairchild, Intel, and IBM had to spend decades and literally hundreds of millions of dollars pumping out these deeply contaminated South Bay aquifers. The very exact industrial sites that birthed the microchip revolution actually became federal toxic disaster zones. It perfectly and tragically demonstrates how early-stage hyper-innovation operated with pretty much an absolute disregard for the long-term ecological health of the local soil and water. Let's transition right into Section 3, the always-on culture, colonizing cognitive labor. Perhaps the most insidious systemic cost we found in the ledger is actually a psychological one. You see, the shift from the traditional 9-to-5 factory era into the agile software era, which was heavily accelerated by mobile-first computing, fundamentally erased the boundary between professional labor and personal existence. And this brings us to a concept called quantified self-stress. What is that? Well, it's the intense use of enterprise tools, things you probably use every day like Slack and Jira, to track human workers. It basically equates not being online with not being committed, all within this grueling 24-hour hacker house framework. Think about it. The exact same digital tools used to track venture capital milestones or monitor neural network training loss curves are now deployed to track and enforce a permanent state of alert readiness on actual human beings.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the concept of the attrition of deep work. This constant, real-time demand for status updates and hyper-reactive communication entirely fragments the human attention span. This hyper-innovation machine demands a workforce that is permanently locked in a state of high-arousal stress. And biologically speaking, that just leads to rapid, unavoidable burnout. It actually destroys and degrades the very same complex, long-term cognitive abilities that these workers need to successfully design the next generation of intelligence. It's a total paradox. Okay, moving right along to Section 4, infrastructural strain, looking at the absolute limits of the physical grid. So as we rocket into this modern Phase 7 AI wave, the rapid, explosive expansion of artificial intelligence technologies is pushing the localized physical infrastructure of San Francisco, Oakland, and the peninsula right to the absolute edge of collapse. I mean, look at this. It is a truly shocking fact to wrap your head around. Training just a single foundational AI model requires the power output equivalent to an entire small city. No joke. This unbelievable strain on the local electrical grid has forced utility providers into a really tough corner. They're increasingly having to prioritize the massive energy needs of these exascale data foundries over basic residential consumer growth and overall grid stability. And this brilliantly illustrates a really massive tension. We so often like to think of AI as this completely abstract, invisible thing floating in the cloud. But in reality, it has a massive, heavy, intensely physical footprint. We're talking about massive liquid-cooled GPU racks in the Mission District and down in Santa Clara foundries that require continuous, high-volume water flow. It literally demands constant, intense water cooling to function, all situated in a geographic region that is, historically and currently, prone to extreme, devastating drought. So, the crucial point is, when we evaluate this final ledger, we really have to look at it comprehensively and impartially. When we look over at the gains column, they are absolutely undeniable. This model optimizes for extreme, centralized speed. It has literally built the cognitive architecture of the modern world. It sparked a global software revolution, and it has generated planetary-scale wealth. But those gains are heavily offset by massive debts on the right side of the ledger. To achieve that breakneck speed, the system has systematically depleted local, physical, and human resources. The cost of doing business has been severe housing displacement, toxic Superfund sites, mass cognitive burnout, and severe grid instability. Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative question. As we look toward 2026 and the upcoming deployment of fully autonomous machine intelligence, we have to ask, is this ledger sustainable? The source material makes one thing incredibly clear. These systemic costs are not a bug or a flaw in the system. They're a feature of exactly how this technological progress is structured. So we have to ask ourselves, will a society that essentially eats its own habitat and burns out its own workforce just to maintain a competitive lead eventually wake up to find it has absolutely no ground left to stand on? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive gave you a clear, structured understanding of the true, hidden costs of hyper-innovation. See you next time.